This is about Power BI and Power Automate, how to use them better together. And this is a little bit about me. Get rid of this little screen here. So I'm an associate director and trainer at P3 Adaptive. I do have my Microsoft MVP award. I was given that in the fall of 2020, so nearly 2 years of that. Over my career, I've worked with a lot of different companies, from small businesses to Fortune 500 enterprises. I am a CPA, so that is my background, and I did that most of my career, although I really don't like debits and credits, and that's how I got into data. As has been noted, I have a Twitter account that you can see there, and the P3 Adaptive website is there. So if you need to get in touch with me, you can do it on Twitter, or back on this first page here is my email address. And we do the full Power Platform stack. We focus on Power BI, but we do Power Automate, Power Apps, Azure, Data Factory, the whole thing. So, but my main focus is Power BI. So that is it for the presentation. So now I want to go right into what we're going to do. So I'm assuming a lot of you have used Power BI, and maybe you've used Power Automate, maybe not so much. What I want to do is just dip in a little bit and show how you can use them with each other and actually integrate them together. And we're going to start with a couple of very simple things. The first thing is, this is a very simple report that I have. And there are a lot of requests from people to be able to just go in and refresh that report whenever they want to, for whatever reason. Maybe, it's used very rarely. Setting up scheduled refresh doesn't work because it's not ready for them when they need it. Or they need to run checks at a certain day of the month, and they have got all their work in. They want to hit that button, refresh the report, and know what it is, not wait for the next hour for that thing to refresh and show the updated data. So with Power Automate, that now integrates into Power BI, the user can click a button in the report and it'll refresh. So that's the first thing we're going to do. So over here on the right-hand side, we've got all of our visuals. And this visual right here that I have my cursor on is the Power Automate button for Power BI. So it's a visual that we're actually going to drop into the report. So it's a little bit of an odd visual. When I add it to the report, it doesn't look like a lot of other visuals. There's no place to drop your data necessarily. And actually, if I expand this, it's really a set of instructions on how to do certain things. And it says, add your data, set up your flow, etc. So it's a little intimidating when you first go into it, but it's really not that big of a deal. So I'm going to shrink it down and put it over here in this area. And what we want to do is the more options button. So every visual has its own little more options, like this matrix up here. You click on more options and you can do the sorting and etc. When you click on this one to do more options, basically there's an edit button. And what this edit button does is it actually launches Power Automate in your tenant inside of Power BI. So you'll note that we're actually in Power BI. So what I want to do is add a button to this report that will refresh the report. So I'm going to go over here to my tenant, and bear with me because when you're doing Power Automate and Power BI, you're swapping screens and going to 5 different browser sessions, etc. So I'm going to go to Power BI. This is the actual workspace that we're in, and this is the report. This is the data set that we're going to look at. And you'll notice here, all of these times are, I happen to be in Arizona right now. We don't observe daylight savings, so we're really on Pacific time right now. So 4:52, when I was testing this before we got on this call, was the last time this was refreshed. So kind of pay attention to these times. We're going to see these things update as we go through it. So I'm going to make this report data set refresh using Power BI. So remember, I was in the report, added the button, went in to edit it. What I want to do is I want to create a new flow, and basically we just say an instant cloud flow. It's going to create a new flow, and the action step, Power Automate has 2 things, triggers and actions. Every flow has one trigger and can have many, many actions. So the trigger is a button in Power BI was clicked. There's nothing we can do there. That's all it does. Now we want to say, let's find an action. One of the actions is, if we search for Power BI, and then I click on it here, we will see a wide variety of things we can do. We can do scorecards and get multiple goals. And one of these that I used the other day was run a query against a data set. So I pull data in. So there's a lot of things you can do, but we just want to do something very simple. Refresh a data set. So it brings up this dialog box. We have to say, what is the workspace and what is the data set? So the workspace is the Power BI samples, and the data set is Power Automate and Power BI. That's the data set name. Now, at this point, I could be done with it. The user pushes a button and it refreshes. But to the end user, that doesn't look very good and it doesn't give a lot of information. In fact, there's almost no indication they've pushed the button. So I like to tell the user that something is going on in the background, especially if it is something like refreshing your data set that can take 15 or 20 or 30 minutes. So what I want to do is I want to notify that user that they've pushed the button and the service is doing something for them. You can do it through emails, you can do it through Teams, you could even do it through SMS messaging if you have certain connectors in place. Let's just do this through Teams. So the first thing I need to do is I want to do this in a team. I could do it in a chat or a team. I like doing this in a team where the person gets notified, but their coworkers can see, hey, this report was refreshed, so they don't go in and push a button later either. They won't get notified, but they can at least see it if they're in that team. So to do that, I have to get what is called an @mention token. So when you're in Teams and you go @Jim and it fills out their name, Jim Smith, and they get notified, that doesn't happen automatically in Power Automate. We have to get that token to trigger that notification. So I'm going to type @mention. I could have also typed Teams and it would have shown me all of the actions for Teams, but this is it right here. Get an @mention token for a user. Now, what is the user? So we are in Power BI, remember. So here's the Power BI interface up here. And Power BI is talking directly now to Power Automate. You cannot go to Power Automate in the service, in the web, and create this kind of flow directly. You can edit some things, but not all of the information is there. And basically, this information that is coming from Power BI, when you push that button, all this information is being passed to Power Automate. And what we want to do is the user mention is based on their email address. So we're going to add the user email to this button. And then we're going to create another new step. And I'm going to go to Teams. And what I want is the one that will let me post a message in a chat or a channel. Okay. So I can post it as the Power Automate Flowbot. I could post it as another user if you have impersonation rights, etc. We're just going to use the Flowbot. I want to post it in.
Jeremy brought this up. Where did it get the credentials? Is it the existing BI desktop login?
I think he just answered it.
Oh, sorry.
That is correct.
Yeah, okay.
You have to be logged in to Power BI Desktop to your tenant. And because I've done this so many times, none of the dialogues are popping up. But if you're doing this the first time, you'll get those Microsoft authentication dialog boxes and whatever, and you just click in and then it goes on through.
Yeah, makes sense. Just out of curiosity, can you click the ellipsis on the refresh data set action?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's your connection right there. And it looks like you may actually be able to add a new connection in there.
Well, you could add a new, if you wanted to add a separate email address, like maybe you had a service account you were doing with this, you could assign it to that. Yes.
Got it. I was just going to go down the service principal path, but okay. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. All right. So, so I'm going to post this in a team, in a channel. So I'm going to select the channel. Now the dialog box here is going to expand and say, okay, what team do you want? And the channel is the training data. And now I simply post the message and I will say, your report is refreshing now. And now I have additional dynamic information. Not only do I have the Power BI information, but the @mention token that I did a couple of minutes ago is also giving me 2 additional bits of information. And what I want to do is just use the mention token. So I don't type in their name and I don't type their email. I simply click on the @mention token. And I can also say it started at, and I can use the timestamp, which is the timestamp when the button was pressed. Okay, so at this point I can hit save. Get rid of that thing up there.
And we
So
had
it
a
saves
question
it.
from Fernando was asking, how do you know what team channel the user belongs to? My guess is, I mean, you by building the solution, you're building it for that functional group,
Yep.
unless there's, yeah, okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You would not be doing this generically in a vacuum. If you didn't know, then I guess what you would do is instead of posting it in a channel, you would post it as a chat with the Flowbot, and it would just go directly to that user. But if you're building it for the accounting team, well, then it has to go to the accounting team and a certain channel, general or whatever. So I have saved the data flow. It has given me this horrible name. So I'm going to call it refresh power automate dataset. Okay. And then I hit save and apply. And it's saving. And then I go back. Now, there's one thing that, and when I did save and apply, it sort of did both. The apply is something that is different, and I think somewhat unique to Power BI with Power Automate. In Power Automate by itself, you only have to save it. There's no apply. In Power BI, you have to apply the button, which actually links this flow with that button. If you only save it and you go back, the button is disconnected and nothing happens. So you have to remember to hit save and apply to ensure that it is bound to that button. Now I can go back to the report.
I think it's one more question that popped up. You have to have access to these channels you're posting to, right? To be able to do those @mentions.
Correct.
Like, yeah, that
Correct,
all has
which
to be
is
granted before you even build the solution.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
And Fernando's asking, could you go back to the flow? Fernando, you want to come off mute and just mention what you're asking?
Could you go back to the flow, please?
Mm-hmm.
I just missed the last part.
Here where I'm just adding, posting it to the chat.
So it gets started at this time, but not finished at that time.
Yeah, well, so you actually cannot tell when a Power BI data set finishes refreshing using Power Automate. The purpose of this flow is simply to tell the user the button was pushed, I got it, the report is refreshing. Now, if we know this is a 30-minute data set refresh, you could add that rough information here. This will take about 30 minutes to refresh, or this will take about 30 seconds to refresh, or whatever. But there is no way using Power Automate to know when a data set refreshes. And all of this is going to happen immediately. It's going to refresh the data set and send the message to the user at the same time. The data set's going to refresh in the background, and it may take 30 minutes or an hour or 2 minutes, whatever it is. This is just giving that user some feedback. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the report. And you'll notice that confusing text box is now gone. It doesn't have all the directions. It now actually has a button that says run the flow. So you can move this over here. It has some formatting options. It is not the prettiest button in the world, but if you have some styling guidelines, we could make it yellow. We could do whatever. That's really horrible. I'll go with a dark blue. Now, the user then, you would publish this report, and they would have this button. Okay. Now I'm going to hit Control click, and you'll see here it says triggering, but it happens very, very quickly. Except that seemed to take a long time, which is fine because the user knows what's happened. Now I'm going to be able to see that the data set is refreshing. So if I go to, wow, it's done. So 533, you can see that it's done. And this is a very small data set. I picked a data set that was super small. So it has already refreshed. If I go to the report, now keep in mind, this is only in Power BI Desktop. I have not yet published it. I'll get to that in a minute. If I go to the report and I refresh my view, you'll see that it refreshed at 5:33 p.m. So it happened very quickly. If I go into Teams, we will see here that Power Automate triggered the report, and it said that it started at this time. Now, one thing you'll notice, and we're not going to fix this on this flow, but we'll fix it later. It gives a very computerized, ugly date timestamp. So it's let's zoom in there just a little bit. We can see that we have the year, day, and date. This is also in UTC time, so it's already tomorrow, the 10th. And then it's looks like it's 12:30 in the morning there. So we could adjust for time zones. We could do all kinds of things to pretty that up. But just like the Power BI service, the Power Automate service runs on UTC time, and you have to adjust it in your tenant for your messages for that to work. So now the user knows what's happened. You could provide a link to the report so they could go and look at it, etc. You could dress this up however much you wanted to. Now, the problem with what we've done is, I'm going to go back to the service. This report is actually based on this data set up here called, I'm sorry, based on this data flow called the Contoso data flow. So I didn't really do anything. All I did is refresh the report on top of the data set, and the data set hasn't updated. So to really make this work, we need to have the user push a button. The data set refreshes. Once the data set is done, then it needs to, the data flow. Once the data flow is done, then it needs to kick off the data set. So now we're going to get into a little bit more complex logic on how that works. So the first thing I'm going to do is go back into Power BI. And I'm going to make one edit to this. I'm going to delete the data set refresh because we're not going to do that. Instead, we are going to refresh a data flow. So we have to know what the workspace or the environment is. Environments are Power Platform data flows. Workspaces are Power BI data flows. Then we get our workspace name, which is the same one. Data flow is Contoso. Everything else is the same. We're going to get an @mention token for the user, and it's going to refresh and tell them that we're not going to tell the user that we're daisy chaining data sets and data flows. They don't care. They just want their report done. So we're going to tell them the report is now started. So I'm going to save and apply. But now the problem is they're going to hit that button. It's going to refresh the data set, and nothing's going to happen to the report. So we need to create a separate flow. So for that, we can actually go to the Power Automate service itself. So I'm going to say a new flow, instant cloud flow, and I always skip this. And what I want to look for is the trigger for data sets. I'm sorry, data flows. You should be able to find triggers if I had typed in the right thing to begin with. So we have a number of things that we can do with data flows, but it does have one trigger. Many actions, one trigger. Power BI data sets have no triggers. That's why we can't ever determine when they actually finished. So we can go to this. Again, we select the workspace. And and the data flow. Now, the data flow can finish with 3 different results: success, failure, or canceled. We need to trap those because we only want to actually refresh the report when the data flow is successful. If it's canceled, we don't want to fool with it. And if it failed, we would probably want to send another alert to the data set owner or the data flow owner saying, hey, there's a problem with the data. You need to go and look at it. So what I want to do is first, I need to create a variable to store the data flow operation. Initialize variable. So in Power Automate, to do a lot of work, you need to use variables. You can't, it's difficult to modify dynamic content from other bits of information. So for example, remember I told you the timestamp looked weird. We're going to fix that later on, but we're going to fix it using a variable. We're not going to try to fix it dynamically on the fly. It's difficult to troubleshoot, and sometimes it simply doesn't work. So we're going to initialize a variable. You have to initialize the variable. You can't just start using a variable. So I'm going to call this our refresh result. I start all my variables with var, whether it's in Power Query, DAX, Power Automate, even the Excel let function, just so I know it's a variable. This is a string that we're going to be trapping. We can go ahead and trap the value. Now, the value, just so we know it, we have down here refresh status, and that's what we want to get. And if I hover over it, you will see that it will tell you the possible values are success, failed, and canceled. I guess if you're doing this in a different language, it would have the languages that you're used to working with. I know in Canada, you might be on the Montreal side, so you might have some French results there, depending on how you're logged in, etc. So you just want to be sure to know what those are, because we have to do an if-then statement in a few minutes, knowing that it was success. So we're going to simply trap the refresh status, and then we'll do a new step, and this is going to be a control. And it's a condition. It just happens to be the first one here. And we want to say if the refresh result, so here in Power Automate, every step or many steps provide additional dynamic content. So we've already seen the Power BI content earlier where it had the username, the user email, the refresh timestamp, etc. That's dynamic content. When the data flow completed, it had additional bits of information. I could get the data flow name, the ID, the start time, the end time, etc. And as we saw, I also got the refresh result. Since I stored that refresh result in a variable, I can now use that in other places. And so that's what I want to do. I want to grab the refresh result is equal to success. And if it's yes, I want to refresh the data set. I could type. So I'll click on Power BI and refresh the data set. And again, we get the unique workspace ID. And now I want to refresh Power BI Automate data set. And at this point, I'm going to hit save. I could enhance this. I could say if it's not over here, I could add another condition. Was it failed? Well, if it was failed, then I would send something to the data set owner or the data flow owner saying it failed. I could alert someone. If I really wanted to, I could give additional information to the user. Hey, the data flow has finished. The data set is now refreshing. Again, I don't think most end users give a flip. They just want the whole thing to run. So I'm not going to enhance this, but I have created flows here that have like multiple conditions, and it's just huge. But we're going to stay with this very simple concept. So now I'm going to hit save. And I need to name this. So refresh data set. when data flow refresh is successful. Okay, so that will save that. So again, there's no save and apply here because this is not part of a button. This is just a pure flow that is running in the service and it's monitoring Power BI. Now, there is one thing that we need to do to make this button work. So this is my data flow monitoring tool. So when it finishes, go refresh the data set. This is the flow that I created in Power BI that is now attached to a button, and it's going to automate it's going to refresh the data flow. It's actually not going to refresh the data set now because I've changed it. Maybe I'll rename it real quick. But what I wanted to show you is back here. Okay, so this is the refresh the Power Automate data flow. I am the only one that can run this. These are all my credentials, and if anybody else in the service goes and pushes that button in the report and they press it, nothing's going to happen. They don't have permission to run this. This is one thing you have to do in the Power Automate user interface, get out of Power BI, and it is this run only user's permission. You have to share this with everybody that you want to be able to push the button. It can be individuals, it can be security groups. Here, I'm going to do the entire team. So now everybody in that team, so maybe it's the entire accounting team or the entire supply chain team, whatever it is, they now have access to all of these features and they can run only. They cannot edit it. If they went in and looked at this and tried to edit it, they would not be able to see it. They are a run only user, but it will work.
Quick question, Ed. Is
Yes.
there any licensing gotcha with this? Or is this all with the standard licensing?
Yeah, so everything I'm showing you is standard licensing. There is nothing premium required on the Power Automate side to do any of this. The Power BI side, maybe you need a Power BI Pro license, but the end user does not. So the end user can be, they just have a typical Office 365, probably an E3 or an E5 license. Yep. It just works. As long as your company has provisioned those licenses, which are part of the Office licensing group. There's nothing else to buy.
Gotcha. And then I see Fernando's asking, could you apply OLS to restrict who can see the push, the Power Automate button? My guess is with visuals, that's typically not something you can do.
Yeah, so you can't hide the button using OLS. You could restrict whether or not they could actually push it by making sure they're not part of this group. So maybe they're in the team, you would want to create a smaller security group and exclude that person from that security group. There are hacks out there available. If you Google how to hide pages in Power BI using quote unquote row level security and object level security, those are not secure. Never ever secure your data that way, but you could at least hide a button and that's probably okay. So it's a little bit hackish, but there is no way to restrict who can actually see a visual in Power BI. And this button is just a visual. Okay. So I'm back in Power BI. There's really nothing I have to do here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and publish this to the service, and we'll make the button run there. So I go to Power BI samples, hit select, hit replace. Now, one thing I want you to notice is this is only for 2007 through 2009. So while this is publishing, I am going to swap out some data in the background. Wow, I really hate Windows 11. Copy.
I'm so glad I haven't upgraded yet.
I have a laptop. I have a Surface Laptop Studio, which I love. The only downside is it only came with Windows 11. So The hardware is great. Windows 11, wow, the start bar and the Windows Explorer, they've really messed it up. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the report, and we can now see the button is actually live in the service. So I'm going to hit this button. It says it's triggering. So I'm going to go back to the workspace, and we're just going to monitor it. Look at this. Data flow is already going. If I go to Teams, I have another at 547. This thing is cranking. This should not take that long. It's only about 100,000 records. So it is done. You'll see the spinning ants have gone away. Now I'm just waiting on the service to do its monitoring process. And within a minute or two, this thing should kick off. So we'll give it here just a second. Any other questions while we're waiting for it?
Any questions? I've been loving this presentation, by the way, Ed. We were just chatting in the chat. Like, you bringing this Power Automate in context to Power BI actually really helps. And just these use cases are phenomenal.
Well, good. I'm glad. I'm glad it's working. So that was the data flow. Refresh the data set. Oh, okay. So 3 seconds ago. So see, I'm just being impatient. So here it says it's, oh, there it goes. So now it's doing its thing. So now we see the spinning ants. So now the data set's actually refreshing. So this all happens very, very quickly. It doesn't happen quickly when you're sitting there staring at it, but you can see this all happened in the course of less than a minute and a half. So now if I go to the Power BI report itself and refresh so the screen's all updated, you can see now that I added an entire year's worth of data. I now have a full, 2009 is completely done. There's a little bit in 2010. And you can see that this updated at 549. So no particular deep knowledge here, but we now have given the users the ability to run that report. And this has the horrible name. It says run flow. I could go back into Power BI and click on this here, button text, run flow. You can change that to say refresh report, etc. You can clean that up, do whatever you want. It looks horrible when it's initially done. You do have a limited number of options. So that is one way to allow your users to refresh reports directly within an app. So you publish a Power BI app. They don't have to have access to the workspace to go and hit that refresh button. I don't like giving users access to the workspace. It's confusing and they can do things. Even if you give them read-only access, I just don't like it. Give it to them right in the report and they can refresh that. So any questions about that? If not, we'll take it to the next level. But if there's any questions on refreshing data sets, data flows, things of that nature, let me know. Otherwise, we'll move on. All right. Cool.
I see.
Yeah.
This looks like it should be capable to email out data straight from the report and let people know in Teams, right? I mean, that's the main use case.
To do what now?
It's okay. If you want to come off mute, you totally can.
Yeah.
Are you there? I'll just reiterate. She says, it looks like it should be capable to email out data straight from the report and let people know in Teams.
Ah, okay. Well, actually, you know what? That's actually a good segue because that's what we're actually going to do. I have another page called Sales Blast. And what we're going to do here, this is just very simple. I have not done anything to beautify this. What we want to do is we want to email our sales team their top 5 items, right? I just picked some random data that we wanted to send out. So this is everyone's, sales for the month or whatever it is. These are all the different states, and you can see we have some international states here. So there's a lot of information here. Down here, though, I've built a table visual that has the state and the top 5 order information. So my top 5 order information is simply this concatenate X function function as a measure, and it simply returns the product code, the name. You can see we have the sales here. And then at the end of each line, I have this, let me just bring it up here in the DAX editor. I have the unicharacter code, code 10. Code 10 is a carriage return. So it nicely formats it. What I want to do is I want to send this information out to my sales team. I don't even want to give them access to the Power BI report. So we're going to do that using Power Automate. So we're going to create another button. We get the nice confusing text. Now, here, we're actually going to use this part of the visual. We're going to add data fields. For refreshing report, you don't need any data fields, but for this we do. And think about what we need. I need the email address. I need to know the salesperson's name. In this case, we're going to use the state that it applies to. And I need to know what the data is. So it's this order data here, right, that I've clicked on here. So we are going to go to the customer table and we're going to get the email address. And I'm on the wrong visual. Click back on the Power Automate visual. Add the email address to the field well. Add the state to the field well. And then I'm going to add the measure to the field well. Now, for those of you that understand Power BI, you need to understand what level of granularity you're going to do. What we want to do is send out one email per state in this case, or per person, okay? If I were to go to the order table, the sales table, and bring in the order number, it is now going to send one email per person per order. And that would be the equivalent of going to this matrix visual here and adding the order number. And you can see now that our level of granularity is much more. I would be sending out dozens of emails for the Alabama region and dozens of emails for the Alberta region. That's not what we want. So we're going to get rid of the order number here. And I'm going to click back on this visual and get rid of it here. In fact, this visual here that I'm clicking on, the matrix, we don't need that. That is to help me as the developer understand what information I'm passing to Power Automate, because it's kind of difficult to look over in the field well and know exactly what's going on. But if I look over here, I can say, okay, well, I've added the state and I've added the order details. Great, that's what's going to be sent. So now we have our email address, state, and order details. So now I'm going to click on More Options, Edit, and it's going to kick me into Power Automate. Now I'm going to minimize these two panels over here because I can get more information on the screen. I'm going to say New, Instant Cloud Flow. And again, it's going to give me the button was pressed. I don't need any more information. So what I need to do now is I need to click on a new step. And what I want to do is send an email. So I'm going to pick Office 365 emails. So email. So be careful in Power Automate because there's a bunch of different ways to send emails, including some third-party premium visuals. So I want to send an email. So here we go. Okay. Now, I want to send it using the email address. So I am in Power BI. So again, you can see my Power BI screen. I'm embedding Power Automate inside. If I open up dynamic content, we can see here that I have some values that I am able to use. I'm going to click on, I don't want the user email. I want the email address from the Power BI system. So it's coming from the data set basically. So I'm going to click that and you'll notice what happened is my email action is now embedded in an apply to each step. Power BI told Power Automate we're going to be doing something over a table. And it doesn't matter if the table has 1 record or 100 records, it's going to do like a for each loop. for each record in the table, do this thing. So that's where we're going now. So it automatically did that. I didn't have to do that. It collapsed my email. I can simply re-expand that. And I simply want to say the subject of the email. So I could say, here are your sales for, and now there are more things that are available. So the service is a little bit intelligent. Remember, in the to field, it recognized only the text strings that looked like email. So there was the user email and the email from the data set. Now I'm in an open text box, and there's many other things I can put in here. I can put in the timestamp, I could put in the username. What I want is the state. So I'm going to add the state to it. And then I'm going to say, here are the top 5 orders for last month. And now I want to add the order details, which is the measure, right? So again, when you're looking at this data, this dynamic content, anything that starts with the word Power BI is coming from the data set. Anything that has the Power BI icon but does not have the words Power BI, it is some sort of metadata about what happened when the button was pressed, when it was pressed, who pressed it, their email address, etc. So typically at this point, you want to make sure you're using the Power BI information, because that's the data set information that is going to be embedded in this email and sent out. Okay. Now, a couple of other things I want to do though. I want a log of what was done. I don't just want these emails to go out and I don't know what was sent, who got what, etc. So what I want to do is create a log. So I want to know what state was sent and when it was sent. So I'm going to add an action. I'm going to create another variable. I need the state. The state is simple. That's just the state from Power BI. I also want the timestamp, but I don't want that ridiculous timestamp that we saw earlier. I want a timestamp that a human can read. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to store the timestamp in it, and then I'm going to modify that timestamp to be in a human readable format. So I'm going to initialize a variable. Oh, actually, you know what? I cannot do that here. Hang on. You cannot initialize a variable inside of an apply to each statement, because you'll initialize it multiple times. That's not allowed. I need to go up here and initialize it first. I can then use it in the apply to each. So initialize a variable. So you'll see I just went out of that step, that apply to each, which has all this information. You can go up here. I can add, insert new steps, etc. So you can work out of order like I just did. So I'm going to call this BR timestamp. Actually, I'm going to call it date, and I'll show you why in a minute. It is a text string. I'm not going to do an initial value because I don't know what the initial value is. I don't really care. I'm going to make sure it's done within the apply to each statement so that as it happens, it'll be added to it. So I'm going to go to, now I'm going to go back to my apply to each, add an action. And what I want to do is set the variable. And I want that var date to be the timestamp, which is that hideous text string. Now I want to format it. So there's another operation in Power Automate called compose. It's an action. The data operation, compose. The input, now I'm going to use the expression builder. So I can go into the expression builder and build a function that will convert that timestamp. And it is called get, I'm sorry, it is called format date time. So just to pause here for 1 second, everybody that uses Power BI knows that it has 2 languages, DAX and Power Query or M language. They are nothing alike. Power Automate and Power Apps, even within the Power Platform and probably Power Virtual Agents, also have their own languages, their own functions, and their own idiosyncrasies. I don't know why, but Power Automate, all the words of a function are capitalized except the first word. So it's lowercase format, uppercase date, uppercase time. I don't know why, it just is. Okay, so that
And
was
that's
a little
only for
side
Power
rant.
Automate?
Do what?
And that's only for Power Automate?
Yep, that's only for Power Automate.
Why does
and I'll give
Microsoft
you an
have to
example
do
of how
this to us?
ridiculous it is. In Power Query, if you want to count the number of rows in a table, there's a function called table row count. Okay, very simple. In Power BI, you use count rows. In Power Automate, there's a function called length, and that's how you measure how many records there are in a table. So I'm just going to tell you now, if you start doing Power Automate and you start getting into the functions, until you get your head around it, you're going to spend a lot of time on Google going, how do I count rows in Power Automate? How do I change date formats in Power Automate? Because the language is very, very different.
Darn
Okay.
you, Microsoft, just make it consistent.
Exactly.
Please. One
This
day.
is the problem, though. All of these were developed independently, including Power Query. Power Query was not developed at the same time Power BI was.
Yeah,
They were
right.
sort of developed knowing one or the other was going to exist, but they're very different technologies and they don't work at all the same way. There's almost no logic that's the same between the two, and that's embedded in one project, one product. So you can just forget Power Apps and Power Automate. Those came from entirely different areas. So that's why I focus on one thing, because my brain's not big enough to hold all these commands in all three languages. So we're going to format the date time. What are we going to format? I'm going to click back here on the dynamic content, and we're going to format the variable var date, and we need a parameter to tell it how we're going to format it. And believe it or not, it is use single quotes in Power Automate, not double quotes. And the format string G just means general. I could be much more exact with the YYY, MMN, DD, and all that kind of mess. I just want the general time. I'm good. That's all I need. So I'm going to hit OK, and it embeds it in this formula. So we can see here, it didn't stick. My tooltip's hovering over, but if I try to zoom in, it disappears. But it has created this function. It's kind of this little embedded function that has the format date time of the variable. And that is going to be, now I have a decent date. So what do I want to do with that? I want to add it to a log. So in a real world, you're going to add that to a SQL server, maybe a SharePoint list. Here, I'm really lazy. I'm going to add it to an Excel spreadsheet. So it's going to go through, create this email, set the variable. I'm going to go to Excel. We want Excel Online for Business. Okay, that's what works in Office 365. And I'm going to add a row to a table. Okay, now that's very important. I'm not going to add a row to a spreadsheet. I'm going to add a row to a table. So let me show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to Power. No, I am in Teams, Training Data, Files. I've already created the file. It's called Power BI Sample Email. So I'm just going to open it up here and show it to you. So this is a table. So if you don't know what a table is in Excel, it is not a grid of data. If I click over here, you'll notice there is no table menu. When I click up here, you'll see there is a table menu that pops up. Same thing happens in Excel on the desktop. A table is very special. It has special properties. When I click on it, I get an entire different set of ribbon items. And you'll notice the table has a name. Normally it's called table 1, table 2. You can just go up here and rename it and do whatever. I call it table log. And I've got two fields, date and the state. Okay, so this is the log that I'm going to populate from Power Automate. So I'm going to go back to Power Automate. Wow, which window was I in? Oh, I was in Power BI Desktop, wasn't I? Yes, okay. So yeah, I get so many windows are open. So I have to figure out the location. So where is this file? It's in one of my teams. You typically want to select the one that's called SharePoint. So Teams is based, the file structure is based on SharePoint. So if you're connecting it to a file in Teams, you're going to want to use the SharePoint site, not the groups. So it's the SharePoint site, GNDN. Pop quiz, does anybody know what GNDN stands for? Any Star Trek fans?
Quiz. You get a free sticker.
Yeah. No Star Trek fans?
GNDN.
It stands in the original series from the early 60s, late 60s. When Kirk and Spock were walking down the hallways, there would be all these tubes sticking out of the wall just for effects. And GNDN was often stamped on the side. It stands for goes nowhere, does nothing.
Jeremy got it. Jeremy chatted that.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. So give him the sticker. Awesome.
Jeremy, you get a sticker, bud. I'll walk it over today.
So this is my team that does nothing. It goes nowhere, does nothing. It's just for demos. So, so then you have to find the document library within Teams. It is almost always going to be documents. If you've got a SharePoint admin that loves to change things, get with them and figure out what it is, because they can do whatever the heck they want and change the defaults. But if your Teams are default, it's going to be the document library. Now we have to go pick the file. So now it's actually showing me all of the folders, and I can drill down multiple levels. Ultimately, I'm going to click on the Power BI sample email. It is now connected to that file, and now it's saying select a table. It cannot work with sheets. It cannot work with ranges. It must be an actual table. That's why that was important. And you'll see it's already found it it's opened up the file. It found the log. Now it's analyzing that table and it says, oh, you have two fields, date and state. Well, what's my date going to be? I'm going to populate it. Let's see if I can scroll here. I don't want to populate it with this. That is that ugly long string. I want to populate it with my compose step. Now, if I had done this right, I would have renamed compose to format date. Then I would know what this is. I forgot to do that earlier, but that's the actual step. It's the compose step. The reason you don't want to leave it compose is if you have multiple compose, then it's just compose 1, compose 2, compose 3, and who knows what the heck's going on. So I generally try to rename the steps as I'm going through them to make the most sense, especially in a complex flow. This one's not very complex. There's only one compose operation. The state, I don't need to do anything with the state. It's just the state. So I can get that from the Power BI data. So I'm going to click that and hit save. And then I'm going to go through and I just want to make sure the button's clicked. I've initialized my date variable, email. I think everything is good. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to go up here and hit save and apply. So that's now going to bind it to the button in the report. I always like to hit apply one more time before I go back. So I get this little green bar that says you successfully applied that button. I should obviously rename that because that API connection, blah, 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 is horrible. But I'm going to leave it there for now. Now I have that button here to where I can run the flow. Now, let me give you a word of caution. If you have a button that has this kind of power, which is going to send out an email blast, you want to make sure you've informed your users or even restricted your users to where something has to be selected for this thing to run. Because if I press this now, it's going to send out about 50 or 60 emails. That's not going to cause a problem. But if there are 1,000 states, it's going to send out 1,000 emails, and you can run afoul of Microsoft's anti-spam measures, and they might temporarily throttle or shut down your ability to send email. So just be careful. We were talking about Ken Poles earlier. He said he actually did that. He did it and he shut down email in his system. He had to call Microsoft and they had to unlock it because it looked like a spam outbreak. So he was like, I messed up in Power Automate and I didn't restrict it. So what we're going to do is we're going to select 3 states.
Quick
gonna use
question.
Control
We have a
click.
couple questions that came up. I want to pause you for. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's go ahead. Yeah, let's ask the questions.
Linda said, can you send an email conditionally? Only if a sale order contains a specific product.
Yes and no. Through Power Automate, no. But here, you would do the condition in your measure. And if the products were not in a certain list, you would return a blank, and then it would not even show up in this list. So you would use DAX to accomplish that.
It's a good call. And then Amon mentioned the email body is missing the measure. Maybe that was just a typo, or I didn't catch that part.
Was it missing the measure? Did I mess up and not push a button? Entirely possible.
Amon, do you want to come off mute and just mention what you caught?
Well, I was just I was looking at what Ed did, and I think it wasn't in there, but it goes pretty quick, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, sorry if I'm going fast. If I need to, you know what? Thank you, because that would have sent that email and nothing would have happened. Yeah, so here are the top 5 orders for last month. I think I spent time talking about it, and I don't think I ever clicked it. So I want Power BI data, order details. And actually, I want to make sure there's a carriage return there, so it shows up on a separate line. So here's your top 5 orders for last month, and there's going to be your details. Thank you. So I'm going to hit save and apply again. So it's saving. Go back to the report, and I have selected 3 states. We're just doing a test. So I'm going to hit Control and click the button. Okay. In the service, the user does not have to click Control, but in the app, because I'm in Power BI, if I just clicked it, it would select it and then allow me to change it, not actually trigger the button. So it has run the flow. So now I need to go and see. So if this works, this is my test email. So if this works, I should see some emails. Boom, there they are. So it took it a second, but the email showed up. And I have these all going to me, obviously. I don't have different salespeople sending emails out. I'm sending all these to myself. So I've hard-coded what that email address is in the data set. And it says, here are your sales for Alabama. So it sort of worked, it sort of didn't. It went here, it said, here are your sales for Alabama. That worked. Top 5 orders, and here's the top 5 orders. The problem is it ignored my Unicode 10 character for a carriage return and just crammed it all together. So it looks horrible. So we need to fix that. So now I'm going to show you a little bit about how to troubleshoot and see what's going on in Power Automate. For this, I'm going back to the actual Power Automate user interface, which is here. Here it is. So when you run a flow, every time a flow runs, whether it's scheduled or whether you push a button, there is a 28-day history that shows up down here. And you can see an incredible amount of detail in this run history. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to open up the run history. This is sort of diagnostic, sort of troubleshooting bugs. We can see everything that happened, raw inputs. I mean, when you push a button, Power BI is sending this JSON array to the button, and the button does stuff. And I think it has, so it has a bit of information about it. I think that the outputs, a lot of information here. This is where the user information comes from, etc. So a lot of information there. Not much you can do about it because that is simply a button. It's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is what happened to that email. So here we go to the apply to each. So now that I've opened it up, you'll see what it's doing. I had 3 states selected. So it's going to give me the ability to cycle through all 3 steps. So this, if you've ever used Visual Basic for applications, VBA, or any other kind of coding language, you can kind of step through and see what it's doing at each iteration. You can do that in Power Automate with your run history and see where it worked or where it failed. We're going to look at the first one. I want to look at that first email. There's my email address it went to. That worked. Here is the body. Now, this is interesting. The body has my line breaks, but the email didn't. But look at this. You can see here, these are HTML strings. So Outlook is sending an HTML email. An HTML email does not honor the Unicode line feeds and carriage returns, etc. I need to add a break at the end of each line. Well, you can do this in Power Automate. You would have to find the Unicare 10 code. It's in here. It's just not being honored. It's right there. It's invisible, but it's there. And then do a replace and do a bunch of complex stuff. Or you can change your DAX. So I'm actually going to go to my measure. Here. And what I want to do is I'm going to comment this out. I'm not going to use that. I'm going to add and quote the break character. Now, that does not look awesome on the report. Okay. But again, in the report itself, this is a diagnostic tool for me. As soon as I'm done, I'm either going to hide this visual or delete it. I don't need it. Power BI, the button, is using these fields. It has nothing to do with this visual. That's just to help me understand what's going on. So before I publish this, that's gone. I don't care what it looks like. But now let's run it. And just to make sure we're running it okay, I'm going to clear this. I'm going to select 3 different states, Illinois and Kentucky, and I'm going to run the flow. So it's triggering. I'll go back to my email. So I'm just going to delete these 3 and wait for these other 3 emails to come through.
Cue the Jeopardy music. There we go.
There we go. So let's look at Berlin and look at that. So now the break character in HTML was honored, and now the end user gets a nice table. Now, you can actually get really fancy with this. You can take that data from Power BI, convert it to an array, actually wrap it in an HTML table, complete with lines between the columns and the rows, and get really ridiculously fancy with it. There's tons of articles out there. That is what I call next level Power Automate stuff. But for this simple example, it's showing you how to get started. The root capability is there. Making it fancy is taking it to another level. Now, let's go back to my teams and look at this. So now all of the emails I sent in 2 batches are here, and the timestamps look good. Now, the timestamps are sort of wrong because they're UTC time. I would have to go and look, I'd have to Google it, but there's a conversion to say, okay, change the time zone by converting it to, what are we at, -7 right now for DST or whatever it is. And it would change that back to August 9th, and it would have run at 6:19 p.m. or whatever. And then the log would be accurate. But now I have an accurate log of what was sent. I could add their email address as to who it was sent to. I could even add the results of the measure in a cell. It would just be a big table. You can do whatever, but now I have a good log. So that's how to get data out of Power BI to the end user. So a really good way to use this is if you're sending it to people not in your organization, okay, you're sending it to vendors. I set this kind of flow up, somewhat more complex with how it was formatted and things of that nature. But they were sending purchase order information when the purchase order was late, and it was sending it to the factories, complete with when you said it was going to be done and where is it done and how many days late it is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, somebody from the purchase ordering department is just going in and saying, I want to send it to this vendor, hit a button, and all the late POs get sent, and it's all done at once. So your possibilities here are somewhat endless. It's just limited by your imagination. Any questions about that?
I think we're just picking our jaws up off the floor, Ed. So
Oh, well,
give
okay.
us some time.
Okay.
See applause? Yes. There we go. See, very nice.
Okay. All right. Do we have time for one more example, or do we want to kind of bring it to a close here?
Ed, give us one more if you got it.
Okay, this one's much, much quicker, but could also be very, very powerful. This also involves refreshing data. As you know, if you go to Power BI, and let's go to this data set here, we'll go to the scheduled refresh. I'm going to turn this on. We will know that you can only do it daily or weekly, and there's so many. I'm sorry, there's my time zones. You can add times, but it's only on 30-minute increments. There's a lot of limitations in this scheduled refresh. You cannot send out reports on the first day of the month, for example. It's not possible with the scheduled refresh. Or I'm sorry, refresh them on the first day of the month. You cannot refresh reports, on these periodic cycles for accountants, things of that nature. What I want to do is set up a scheduled refresh strictly using Power Automate. And I've started using Power Automate for a lot more of my Power BI refreshes, and I don't even use scheduled refresh in the Power BI service anymore. So here we're going to go straight to Power Automate, go back to flows, new flow, cloud flow. It's going to be a scheduled cloud flow. And we're going to say accounting refresh. So what does that mean, accounting refresh? So as many of you know, if you've worked with accountants, you know that you cannot talk to them the first 5 or 6 days of the month because they are busy working on the accounting reports. They got to get journal entries in, financial statements are due by the end of the week, etc. So you simply don't talk to them. They're working on reports. So what we want to do is we want to set up reports that for the accountants refresh very quickly during the first 5 days of the month. And then after that, they don't really refresh at all because they don't care. By the 15th of the month, they're looking at something else and the month is closed. But these reports, they need to be updated every 30 minutes for those first few days of the month. I'm actually going to hit skip here and do scheduled here. A little bit easier for me to get this. I'm going to run Power Automate every 15 minutes. You can set it for minutes, seconds, whatever, but I'm going to run it every 15 minutes. Here, you can get into a licensing issue because you're only allowed in the basic plan, I think it's 2,000 flows per month. And if you start running a bunch of flows every 15 minutes, you're going to hit that 2,000 limit. It's not a big deal. You can pay like $10 a month and get an extra 10,000. But I do want you to know that you might run into this issue here, but this is for the person creating the flow, not for the people in your organization. They don't need a license for this at all.
And just to make sure I'm not saying this wrong, but when you automate these scheduled refreshes using Power Automate, it doesn't count against your pro like 8 refreshes a day, does it?
That's not correct.
It's not correct.
So
it does correct.
It does count. So in premium, you know that you can refresh using scheduled refresh 48 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
Using Power Automate with premium, whether it's premium capacity or premium per user, it's infinite. There actually is no hard limit on how much you can do. Microsoft may institute the 48 rule, but there is no actual hard rule, so you could refresh every minute if you wanted to. In Pro, you're allowed 8 refreshes every 24 hours. You can burn through those in Power Automate. Even pushing the button, it triggers one of those, it uses one of those tokens, those refresh tokens, and that token is now unavailable for 23 hours and 59 minutes until the next day.
So it doesn't count,
if you're in a
'cause I know
pro
you can do-
environment, be careful.
So because I know you can do if you do manual refreshes in Power BI, that doesn't count against your 8. So
Correct.
somehow it knows it's Power Automate and it's going to burn that token.
It knows because if I go to the refresh history, refreshes from Power Automate are triggered via API, via the service. They're scheduled. On demand is when you go and manually push that button, or you publish the report and it'll do an on demand. So
Gotcha.
all of these APIs are counting against my refresh. Now I'm in a premium per user workspace here, so I get infinite, so it doesn't matter. If you're in a pro environment, you want to be careful that, you know, somebody's in a pro environment is not hammering that refresh button 8 times between 8 and 10 in the morning, and then you're kind of done for the day, and nobody's going to see anything until the next day. So be careful in a pro environment. It does count.
That's a good trick to know about Power BI Premium. They're not actually monitoring those refreshes, kind of like with Power Virtual Agents. You can continually refresh your trial and nobody's going to say anything about it.
Yep. Yep. And Microsoft, they are monitoring it. If it gets abused in your environment, they might restrict you and not restrict the rest of the world. So if they see that you're doing all these massive data set refreshes in a PPU environment and it's causing a lot of server thing and you're doing it like, you know, every 5 minutes for months on end, you might get restricted. But
Gotcha.
Right now they're not fooling with it. So okay, so let's go back to Power Automate. Okay, now every 15 minutes, but I only want to do this on the first 7 days of the month. So I need to initialize a variable because I need to trap that time. So I want to initialize a variable, and I'm going to call it VAR day, and this is going to be an integer. And the initial value is, let me make sure I get this right. Let me scoot my screen over just a bit. I need to write an expression. So the function is day of month, and then, so that once again, Power Automate has its own thing. There's no today function. There's no now function. It is UTC now. So again, I could do the timestamp conversion or the time zone conversion and all that stuff. But what this function is going to do is UTC now is going to return the current time, and wrapping that with day of month is going to convert that to just the day. So if I run it now, I know today is the 9th, but in UTC it's going to be a 10. It's going to return 10 to this variable. So I'm going to hit OK. There is my day of the month. I'm going to hit a new step. I'm going to do a condition. If my day is less than or equal to, let's say 11, then I'm going to run the yes condition. And the yes condition is simply Power BI. And we'll go through the exercise of setting up a dataset refresh. And so now I'm not going to go through this whole process because you see where I've gone here. Every 15 minutes for the first 11 days of the month, this accounting report that I'm theoretically going to connect to is going to refresh. And then after that, it's going to do nothing for the rest of the month. So it saves on your capacity. You only need it when the accountants have to have that done. So setting up refreshes using Power Automate can be extremely powerful. You could say, I only want this to happen if the hours are also between the hours of, you know, say 7 in the morning and 10 at night. So it's not doing it overnight when people are asleep, but it is doing it extended hours when the accountants are probably working overtime. So you could set up a lot of different conditions. If I go to this condition, I could say, you know, and the hour is greater than this and less than that, et cetera, et cetera. So again, a lot of power here. And if you ever get frustrated with the Power BI scheduled refresh limitations, just turn it off, go to Power Automate, and do whatever you want.
And again,
All right.
just want to thank you so much for coming and being part of our user group.
I
Hopefully we
love
can
it.
host you again next year. Always love getting more P3 folks involved. And this was just such a relevant topic, bringing our worlds of Power Automate and Power BI together.